Hello everybody, welcome to another one of my PowerBox series of videos. In this particular video we're going to be covering off adding a basic telemetry sensor to the system. We're going to look at setting some alarms up and having a look at the display itself, in particular some of the alarm symbols that we can actually display on the screen, and also the min, max, peak, hold functions that this system is capable of. So for this video we're going to be using a basic voltage sensor. In this particular case we're using the V60, PowerBox V60. Hopefully my camera focuses correctly. And as you can see, it's quite a small sensor, single input voltage sensor. So you can see the pins on the left hand side. Nothing too detailed here, nothing too complicated. I'm going to connect this to my PBR9D receiver, which I'm using for this particular video, and we connect it to the P2 bus port. So as most PowerBox users would be aware, the P2 bus is the telemetry bus. So on that particular bus, it's a high-speed bus. You have all the 26 channels available to you that the system can provide, as well as all this telemetry data. Okay, so just bear with me for a second while I connect it to the receiver. And the actual input of the sensor I'm going to connect to one of my lab power supplies. It's just a DC power supply that's variable from about 1.2 volts to 20 volts. I'll just turn the receiver on. I just dropped my stylus. Sorry about that. I'll switch my camera to manual focus so the focus doesn't shift too much with my hands waving around. I've turned on the receiver. You'll notice these two little antenna symbols at the top right hand corner have got the little RF waves, or whatever you like to call them. They're indicating that telemetry is being received from the receiver. Okay, so we're good to go. So the receiver's bound, it's connected to the radio, but we don't have any telemetry at this point in time. So to display telemetry, what do we need to do? First thing, we need to set up a little widget. So the system uses widgets to display most of the parameters. To bring up the widget menu, you basically hold your pointer on the screen, touch it again, and now we have the main widget menu. We can set up notes, we can have a link set up, so it's a bit like a browser link, I suppose. You can have a widget where if you touch it, it'll take you direct to that menu item. We can set up timers, that's your normal timers. We can have a servo output indication. So this particular widget will allow you to show you in percentage how much travel the servo's been set to, and it has a linear display. And in this particular video we're interested in telemetry, so we're going to select the telemetry widget. Okay. This is where we add our sensors. So let's click on plus to add a sensor. And you'll notice on the left hand side under the sensor branch we have the PBR9D, which is the receiver. We have the core transmitter. And also we have the PBS V60, which is the voltage sensor we're going to be using for this particular video. So under the receiver you notice there's all these values, and typically with other systems as well, you've got voltage of battery that the receiver's measuring, lost frames, RSSI, LQI. Notice there's 1 and 2 because the PBR9D actually has 2 individual receivers in it. If we go to the core transmitter, you'll notice there's battery, current, CPU temperature, LQI, RSSI for the receive path, and we also have some controls, control ABCD, which is the sticks, gives you like a digital representation of the stick travel, and longitude, latitude for the built-in GPS. Now let's click on the one we're interested in, which is the voltage sensor. We only have one value in this particular instance because the sensor only supports voltage measurement. So let's click on voltage, click on OK. I shouldn't say click, I should say press. And this takes us into the main programming screen for the actual sensor. So we have the sensor here, PBS V60. We can rename this, so you could rename it to, I don't know, voltage sensor, whatever you like. I'll just leave it at the default for this time being. There's a menu item. Some sensors support submenus, so you'd normally enter this to actually go into a submenu to program up some other parameters for that particular sensor. In this case, it's disabled because this particular sensor doesn't support that. There's an address button. So all telemetry sensors have a unique address. As a matter of fact, even a receiver is treated as a sensor, and that has its own unique address. And also power boxes. So if you've got like a PowerBox unit that's connected to the system, that will be assigned its own unique address. The value, in this particular case, the only option is voltage. We have some alarms here which we can set up, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. And then we have basically a cross for deleting this particular sensor if need be. Now I did mention address. If you just hold on this screen there, you'll notice a little window pops up and it shows us the actual address that the sensor's assigned. So the default address for this one is 41. If we were going to add a second voltage sensor, that will also have a default address of 41. So what you'd normally do is touch that icon here, and that would increment the address to the next free available address. That way you don't have an address clash. Okay, now let's go back to the main status screen. Now we've got the widget up, and you'll notice it's got 10 volts on it. There's a little red triangle that's flashing in the background as well. I'll explain that in a minute. I'm just varying the power supply now, so we can go down about 1.2 volts and around about 20 or just over 20 volts, 24 volts. So I'll just wind it back to about 10. The reason I'll use 10 is only because it's only easy. Okay, around about 10 volts. One other thing while we're talking about widgets is we can resize these widgets. So for instance, if you find this widget's too small, you have three options. You have a small, medium and a large. The medium takes up 2 widget positions if you like. Also, if you have multiple widgets on the screen with different sizes and whatever, you can actually move these around to, basically wherever you want them. So if you want it up the top there or, down here, yeah, you can just have it like that. I'll just go back into, go back into this particular widget. I'll go to large, and there's another widget that's sort of sitting behind here. I'll just delete that one, only because I accidentally generated it in my last couple of pushes. Okay, so that's the large widget option, and it actually takes up 4 widget positions. Again, you can move it up around to the left hand side of the screen. You have multiple screens as well, so this is page 1 of 1, so you can have page 2, 3, 4, 5 of 1, as many as you want basically. I don't know what the maximum is, but yeah, you can have heaps. Okay, so you'll notice there's a warning triangle there, so that's part of the alarm setting, and we might as well go in and have a look at the alarms at this point in time, because a lot of people get confused on how to set and read these warning triangles. There's a yellow warning triangle and a red one as well, so I suppose yellow might be, say, warning, and red could be assigned as a critical function. If you want to edit a widget, basically just hold your stylus on the widget, and you'll notice it's wiggling around. You let go, touch it again, and that takes you straight into the programming menu. Now in this particular case, we'll go into the alarm settings, and you'll notice here's the main alarm screen for setting up a basic alarm for this widget. So you'll notice there's some default values in there that are generated. Now let's assume the voltage that we're interested in is, say, 10.00 volts. So if I can adjust the power supply close enough to 10.00 volts, I think 10.04 will do. So that's, say, our nominal voltage. That's a good voltage. So this particular voltage here is the real-time voltage, and you'll notice on the screen at the top here you have a coloured line. So the nominal voltage, or whatever you're measuring, will sit in this green zone, and then you have the yellow zone on either side. So this indicates that in this particular example that the voltage that we're measuring is actually higher than the default or the nominal voltage. And then you have another option like a red zone or critical, and that pertains to a voltage that exceeds a secondary threshold. So basically your nominal voltage is 10.04 volts. we can set this boundary between the green and the yellow. So to do that, we can adjust this box here, and let's set it for, say, let's make it, I don't know, 12 volts. So set it to 12, okay. And let's make the critical boundary, so between the yellow, or orange if you like, depends if you're colorblind or not, between the yellow and the red, let's make that 14 volts. So that'll give us like a 2 volt hysteresis, because the power supply's got a potentiometer on it. It's a bit awkward to adjust here and there. So this is to the right, means above the reading that you have. So if we've got 10 volts, you want to basically set your thresholds above your 10 volt nominal voltage. So we're going to set an alarm at 12 volts and a second critical alarm at 14 volts. Now obviously if you've got a flight pack, you're not really worried about the high voltages, so normally you could set these voltages quite high so an alarm would never be generated. But you need to set these above your nominal voltage, otherwise if you set these too low, below your voltage, the alarm will always come on and stay on. Okay, let's set some voltages towards the left hand side of our alarm trip points. So the left hand side indicates a lower voltage in this particular case. So let's set an alarm for 8.0 volts. So if our voltage drops to 8 volts or below 8 volts, it'll trigger a yellow warning. And let's make another one, say at 6 volts. So if our voltage drops even further, we'll class that as a critical malfunction. Oops. So it's fairly straightforward when you look at these voltages with respect to the coloured line. So those triangles that you saw on the main screen, they will light up either yellow or red depending on which threshold's been exceeded. Or if the voltage drops below our nominal voltage, you still get the same colours. You get a yellow and a red. Obviously if we drop a little bit, brings up the yellow warning. Drop a little bit further beyond our critical point, you get the red alarm. We have some alarms here. I'll go through these in a minute, but you can set like no alarm, a beep of vibration from the transmitter, vibration only, you can do speech only, you can do speech and beep, so basically all the combinations. And obviously the final one is everything speech, beep and vibration. So for this time I'll set no alarm. And there's also a one-shot repetitive function which I'll explain in a second. Okay, so let's go back to our home screen. Now, so why is the alarm flashing? Well, these radios have a max minimum peak hold function. So first of all, let's reset all our alarms. Now the reason the alarm was on was when I first turned it on, I was mucking around with it obviously, and it caught an alarm. The voltages weren't set up. And now that we've reset the alarms, you'll notice there is no alarm. And if you look very, very carefully, I'm not sure if you can see it on the camera, but there's a ghosted image of the warning triangle behind the actual reading. And that'll illuminate once those thresholds are exceeded. So remember, 10 volts is our nominal voltage, and then 2 volts either side. So if we go to 12 volts, anything above 12 volts should light up a yellow triangle. And then if we go to 14 volts, the red critical triangle should light up, and vice versa if we reduce the voltage. So let's have a go. Let me play around with the power supply and you'll see the voltage start changing pretty quick. I'll just start. Notice 11 volts, still fine, no alarms. And remember when I said we can get to about 12 volts, you'll notice an alarm will pop up. There we go. So just over 12 volts, you get the yellow triangle. So that's that first threshold that we've passed, which was 12 volts. So the next one's at 14 volts. So between 12 and 14 volts, we should just have the yellow triangle illuminated. And let's go to 14 volts. I'm just increasing it slowly. There we go. 14 volts, and I can obviously go higher. That'll just stay at red. Now let's reduce it. Let's go back to below 14 volts, and you'll notice the triangle goes to yellow. And we'll drop it back to the nominal voltage range, which is between 10 plus or minus 2 volts. You notice there's no warning now. So let's go below now. Let's go to the other side of that coloured line in effect. So remember the threshold was 8 volts. So if we go down below 8 volts, we should get a warning, yellow warning triangle. There we go. And then if I keep reducing it further to our next threshold, which was set to 6 volts, it turns red. Now this is all very well while you're flying, you know, but we don't look at our screens normally when we're flying. And then, you know, you might take off and the bit of load on the servos, the voltage drops, but then when you land, the voltage comes back up again to 10 volts, and you don't see any warning there, and you think, oh, what's going on? There's not, you know, I don't have any problems. However, remember this radio has a peak max hold function, max and minimum hold functions. So if we go in, oh sorry, that's not how we do it. I'll just go back into here. To access the peak min-max function, all you need to do is double click on a particular widget, and you'll notice it records the maximum and minimum voltage for this particular flight. And in this case we dropped down to 5.43 volts and the maximum was 15 volts. So I'll just close that. So let's go really high. Let's go maximum power supply, about 25 volts. If I drop it down to minimum, 1.2 volts, then I'll wind it back to whatever, so about there. Let's have a look at the minimum, the minimum maximum now. So you notice there we've got 1.28 volts as our recorded minimum and 25.86 as our maximum. Now if you've got a whole lot of widgets up here, we can reset individual settings or whatever, but that can be a real pain if you've got, you know, numerous widgets. You don't want to be going through each one. The radio also allows you to reset all widgets, or min-max settings I should say, for all the widgets just by sliding down on the main screen. And now if I go back into here, you'll notice it's just the current reading, which is 10.38. Now some of you are wondering, well, that's all very well, but I'd like to be able to see the warning triangles you know, when I land. At the moment, if we take off and the voltage drops under load, but then comes back up to normal, we land, and you know, we've got no load on the servos, you know, it doesn't really do us much good because you can't see that the triangle was illuminated. You have to go into the min-max menu to have a look. So it's not really preempting you to trigger you to say, hey, we've got an issue here, the voltage dropped, for instance. Okay, so what we need to do, we can fix that. If we go back into the telemetry widget, go back into the alarm screen. I did touch on this before, the alarm type. We can change that to one shot or repetitive. Now, as far as the visual indication is concerned, repetitive and one shot are pretty much the same. The one shot and repetitive pertain to the audio setting, which I'll explain in a second as well. So let's select one shot. So before we had set it to none, but now let's select one shot and let's see how those warning triangles behave. Okay, so you go for a fly, take off, do a snap roll or something. Oh no, voltage drops, and say it drops below the 8 volt setting, an alarm comes up. So now you come in for a landing, you land the aircraft, and now the voltage slowly, say, comes back up and goes back up to, say, 10 volts. In this particular example, that's our nominal voltage. Now remember in the previous example we had that the yellow triangle just went out. In this case, it's now flashing. So when you land, if you see any of the widgets have a flashing triangle, that actually preempts you to say, hey, there was an issue with this voltage. And now we can actually just go in and have a look at our min-max settings, and you can actually see, oh, look, this is what happened. You know, either the voltage dropped or went high, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Again, that'll stay on flashing as long as we don't go to the red one. In this case, we'll go to red now. So I'll go up to, say, I don't know, 16 volts. And let's say I also drop, doesn't really matter, but say I drop right down to 1.28 volts, and you keep flying, and then you land, voltage comes back up, and you'll notice we now have a red triangle indicating that we've exceeded the second threshold. So we've gone into the critical threshold. You can either go into the high or low end, doesn't really matter. You still will get just the red flashing triangle. And this triangle will stay flashing until your next flight, basically until you power down the receiver. So yeah, you would go into your minimum min-max settings, and yeah, there you go. And you'll notice there's a yellow and a red triangle shown on the screen here as well. And it records the voltages. In this case, went up to about 16.81 volts, but also dropped it down to 1.28. Again, we can reset alerts, and we can reset values and close. And let's just do one excursion just to show it again. Go down to say about, I don't know, 4 volts. Then I'll just come back up to about 10. There we go. So if I touch the screen, got 4 volts and 10 as the highest voltage because I didn't exceed the 10 volt setting on the power supply, but I did just drop the voltage down. So that's a handy feature in regards to being able to fly. Don't have to look at the screen continuously. You land, you check your widgets, and yeah, if any of them have got a flashing triangle, you think, hey, that's a prompt to say there's something wrong, or something went wrong in that particular flight with that particular parameter that you're measuring. Okay, so let's go back into the menu for the widget. Go back into the alarm menu, and I was talking about this particular feature, the one-shot and repetitive option with respect to audio alarms. So let's make an audio alarm. I won't bother with beep, vibration or whatever. Let's do speech only. So one other handy feature with the core radio is the text-to-speech feature, so you don't have to muck around with WAV files or whatever. It comes up with a default setting, but I want to change it. I might call it, okay, let's go back here. So I'm going to set the critical one, so the 14 volt one. At the moment, the default text is alarm PBS V60 voltage. So that might be a bit confusing while you're flying. So let's just call it, I don't know, critical, if I can type properly. It's a bit hard typing with the camera in the way. Oops. You can see I'm a slow finger typer. Critical, say, voltage. Should have got a smaller stylus too. This stylus is a little bit chunky. And we can test the text just before you set it. So
critical voltage. Critical voltage.
Yeah, and you might not like it, so you can actually change it to a different person or whatever. You can go through there. I won't bother. You can play around with that with yourself. And obviously you've got the volume setting as well, so I might just bump up the volume a little bit for the video.
Critical voltage.
So that just says
critical voltage.
Critical voltage. Okay, so remember we've got it set to one shot. So let's see what happens. Let's go to the first threshold, which was set to 12 volts. We don't have any audio set for the 12 volts, so that's fine. We just get the yellow warning triangle. And then remember at 14 volts, we should get a red triangle. And now we should actually get some voice come out of the radio as well.
Critical voltage.
There you go. But let's look at what happens if the voltage drops below the threshold. So we go back to say 13 or even lower. And now let's go back up again. You'll find that the audio doesn't trigger. And this is what they call the one-shot option. So the audio will go off once, but it won't keep going off every time we exceed the threshold. So I can go below and above the threshold all day long. The triangles will reflect the change in the threshold, but the audio doesn't. And that's because we've set it to one shot. So that can be handy for certain alarms where you don't want them to continuously go off. You might want a basic indication of something like a non-critical function. You don't want it to keep going off all the time, especially if you're going above and below the setting all the time. Let's now go for the example where we select the repetitive option. Let's try again.
Critical voltage.
We've got critical voltage, and you heard the audio then. If I go back down, so we've gone just below the 14 volt threshold. Let's go back up again.
Critical voltage.
So now every time I cross over that threshold from 12 volts to 14 volts, or the 14 volt threshold I should say,
Critical voltage.
the audio will be played. So that's the repetitive option. Okay, I think that's probably enough for this video before it gets way too long. There are a whole lot of other options with the audio. You can set up triggers and whatever. And as far as telemetry concerned, there's also another chapter in the handbook under telemetry control, which it goes into a lot of detail on how to set up the telemetry to trigger other functions or switches, logic switches, whatever. It can get quite complicated. And I'll probably cover a little bit of that off in a more advanced video at some later stage. But hopefully this video explains the basic alarm settings and audio settings for most basic telemetry sort of widgets, or telemetry sensors I should say. Thanks for watching.